And now introducing our speaker, Connor Allaby. And just a bit about Connor. Connor is the Interim Farm Manager at Black Creek Community Farm. And he has a master's degree in environmental studies from York University. Before that, he graduated from an environmental engineering program at the University of Waterloo and worked for a few years as an environmental consultant. While at York and living in the Black Creek neighborhood, Connor became involved as a volunteer and resident council member at Black Creek Community Farm. He then sought a staff position in order to participate more directly in small-scale food growing and land stewardship, which he identified as important aspects of a societal transition away from fossil fuels. Aside from growing things, he is particularly interested in and passionate about appropriate technology, green building, ecological design, simple living, conservation, and alternative economics. He has been working with the Market Garden at Black Creek Community Farm since 2017. And now we're going to pass it on to Connor to share what he will present to us today.
Good evening. Thanks for this opportunity to speak with you all. Today, I'm going to talk about how regenerative agriculture can be the cornerstone of a sustainable food system while at the same time helping us confront the environmental and climate crisis that we are facing. It is clear that many current agricultural practices are depleting the soil, which is needed to grow food, are engaging us in no-win chemical spraying against pests, diseases, and weeds, and are heavily dependent on synthetic fertilizers, which require lots of energy to produce, damage the soil ecosystem, and often run off into our waterways, where they disrupt aquatic ecosystems, or leach into our groundwater, where they pose a health threat to those who drink it. What is needed is a paradigm shift to regenerative practices that rebuild topsoil and maximize biodiversity, mimicking natural ecosystems, but in a way that supplies the food we need. As Vandana Shiva, Indian scholar and environmental activist, said, "It is our work with living soil that provides sustainable alternatives to the triple crises of climate, energy, and food. No matter how many songs on your iPod, cars in your garage, or books on your shelf, it is plants' ability to capture solar energy that is at the root of it all. Without fertile soil, what is life?" Regenerative agriculture is primarily about building soil. And how do you build soil? Well, you do it by increasing the organic matter in the soil. Organic matter is what separates soil from dirt. It is the life in the soil, the bacteria, the fungi, the insects, the plant roots, and the worms, along with all of the decomposing material that was once alive. It only comprises a small percentage, often from 2 to 7% or a little bit more. However, organic matter has a host of benefits, including making more nutrients available to plants, promoting healthier root growth, allowing more rainwater to infiltrate, thereby decreasing erosion and flooding, and mitigating climate change by sequestering carbon in the soil. And soils rich in organic matter produce extremely nutritious and delicious food. A nice side benefit. Soil is part of the global carbon cycle, and if you could move to the next slide, there's a little diagram of that. And organic matter lost from the soil is directly correlated with carbon dioxide that is added to the atmosphere. More carbon is stored in soils than in all plants, all animals, and the atmosphere combined. There is as much carbon in 6 inches of soil with 1% organic matter as there is in the atmosphere above a field. Together with a steep decline in the use of fossil fuels, regenerative agriculture has the potential to lower the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, mitigating climate change. Since regenerative agriculture also seeks to minimize synthetic inputs of fertilizers and sprays, working with nature, not against it, it nicely aligns with the need to lower our energy consumption and consequently lower our use of fossil fuels. Since the Industrial Revolution, the conversion of natural ecosystems to farmland has resulted in the depletion of organic matter on the order of 50 to 100 gigatons of carbon due to less plant roots and residues returned to the soil, increased tillage, and increased soil erosion. To put this in perspective, and you can go to the next slide. About 400 gigatons of carbon have been released from the burning of fossil fuels and the creation of concrete since the Industrial Revolution. So the carbon emitted from the soil due to agriculture is somewhere from 1/8 to 1/4 of the entire fossil fuel and concrete production emissions. While this is a great loss, it also represents an opportunity to put carbon back into the soil through better land management practices. It also shows that while regenerative agriculture has the potential to sequester some carbon, it cannot take out as much carbon from the atmosphere as we have added through our careless burning of fossil fuels. And as such, without other sequestration measures, it can only help to mitigate climate change and not totally reverse it. But still, it will help, and it is one piece of the puzzle. So, how do we increase organic matter in our soils? That's the question. There are 5 principles of soil health that are commonly referenced, which include 1, keep the soil mulched, for example, with wood chips or straw or the leftover pieces of the plant after the harvest, which are called crop residues. Principle number 2 is minimize tillage, and I mentioned tillage before, and tillage refers to any action that physically disturbs the soil, for example, using a rototiller or a plow, and you can go to the next slide if you would. This just shows some examples of tillage machines and what tillage is. The main problem with tillage is that it reduces organic matter, and we're trying to increase organic matter. And tillage reduces organic matter by exposing the soil ecosystem to more oxygen. Principle number 3, grow a diversity of crops. Instead of having monocultures of one species of plant, for example, a field of corn, plant polycultures of multiple species which are more resilient to pests and disease, but also are able to capture and store more sunlight and carbon and promote a greater diversity of soil organisms. A good example of a polyculture that you may be familiar with is the Native American Three Sisters planting of corn, beans, and squash. And you can go to the next slide. This is just a small diagram. So the corn stalks are supporting the beans. The beans climb up the corn, and the squash sprawls along the ground between the corn and occupies that ecosystem niche. Principle number 4, keep the soil planted. Always try to have living plants growing in the soil, for example, by replacing a crop with another one as soon as the first one is harvested, or by undersowing or relay planting, which means growing the next crop underneath the first crop so that when the first crop is harvested, the next crop is already there and ready to go. But why keep the soil planted, you might ask? And the reason is because plants themselves are the way in which soil organic matter is increased through their root growth and their conversion of sunlight into carbohydrates. They add carbon to the soil. And point number 5 is incorporating livestock into our agricultural systems. And this may surprise some people who have heard that farm animals are a huge problem for the climate. And certainly they are a problem as part of factory farms separated from the land. However, plants, soils, and animals evolve together and all are essential to a properly functioning ecosystem. My favorite example of incorporating livestock is when sheep are let loose in an orchard at the end of the season to eat all of the fallen and damaged fruit. In doing so, they convert a waste product to meat and wool, fertilize the trees with their manure, and break the pest cycle by eating up all of the pest-infested apples and preventing the pests from overwintering in the soil. So those are the 5 soil health principles, and by applying them, we can reverse the trend of organic matter loss. I'm going to take a sip of water. However, easier said than done. Working at Black Creek Community Farm has shown me how difficult it can be to incorporate these principles into existing farm operations, such as our mixed vegetable market garden, which is certified organic meaning we don't use any pesticides, herbicides, or synthetic fertilizers, and only use inputs that are approved for organic systems. In our market garden, we grow lots of different vegetables, all of which are annuals, meaning that they are planted and harvested within the span of 1 year. It is all very well to say that we won't till the soil, but then how will we prepare the ground to accept the seeds or the transplants, and how will we ensure that our plants do not get outcompeted by weeds? We already own a tractor, which we bought to help us till the soil, so are we to just let it sit there? Do we have the time and energy to abide by these soil health principles, especially when we are uncertain of the outcome and the results for this year's vegetable production? And we have customers that have already paid for their vegetable subscriptions. What we have done before seems to work well. What if changing things introduces unforeseen problems? Do we have the money to make the necessary investments in materials and equipment? And so at Black Creek, we've made incremental changes, tilling shallowly and less frequently, using tarps for weed control and to prepare the ground, using cover crops and mixes of cover crops to keep the ground planted over the winter. Cover crops are just something you grow to improve the soil and to keep the soil covered and not to harvest or to sell. We also try to rotate crops quickly and not leave beds empty, etc. We are not perfect, but it is a process. And there are lots of examples of market gardens that are doing great pioneering work on no-till or no-dig vegetable production. This includes, and you can go to the next slide. This includes Richard Perkins of Ridgedale Permaculture in Sweden, and here's a photo of his market garden where he uses a deep compost mulch system in the beds and wood chips in the pathways to grow all of his vegetables in a no-till method. And then there's Connor Crickmore of Neversink Farm in the US and Charles Dowding of Homeacres in the UK, just to list some of the most prominent practitioners. At the same time, a lot of conventional farms have already switched to no-till methods or conservation tillage because they see cost savings and recognize the importance for the sustainability of their farms. And it is essential that new practices and techniques be profitable for these farmers, since no farmer is going to bet the farm, pun intended, on something that doesn't work. Of course, many of these farms grow monocultures and use pesticides, herbicides, and synthetic fertilizers. They don't need to till because they kill their weeds with herbicides in many instances, which goes to show that no sprays, which goes to show that implementing all of the soil health principles together in an organic system of no sprays while producing good yields and making a living is harder than it seems. Part of the problem seems to be our food system's reliance on annual crops over perennial crops. Perennial crops are those that do not need to be replanted each year. After harvest, they naturally come back. All of our major crops that dominate our diets, like corn, wheat, soybeans, rice, etc., are annual crops, as well as most of our vegetables. It is in the nature of annual crops to need continual replacement every year, and often the tillage or preparation of the ground in order to get good results, although there are no-till techniques that can work. But even if done entirely no-till, annual crops, especially when grown in a monoculture, are effectively two-dimensional from a solar capture perspective. Perennial ecosystems like a forest, for example, have many layers of plant growth: tall trees, short trees, bushes, shrubs, ground cover plants, vines, all photosynthesizing and converting sunlight into soil carbon. And then there is the fact that perennials are active for much more of the year than annuals, again, due to the simple fact that they don't have to restart from scratch every year. They also form more extensive root systems and are therefore more resistant against drought and need less irrigation. If we think back to our principles of soil health, perennial plants immediately help us meet all 5 principles simply because they don't need such frequent replacement. So, how do we grow our food in a forest? Eric Toinsmeyer, author of the Carbon Farming Solution, I'll show it on the screen here, talks about tropical home gardens as a practice, and you can go to the next slide here. Tropical home gardens as a practice that exemplifies agroforestry's climate potential. Agroforestry is just a word that means growing trees amongst other crops or pasture land, for your information. Home gardens have been described as intimate, multi-story combinations of various trees and crops, sometimes in association with domestic animals around the homestead. He writes that they are widespread in the tropics and unremarkable there. But in the permaculture movement, they are known as food forests or forest gardens. Okay, I know what you're asking. All very well for a backyard garden, but how would this work on an actual farm, you ask? Well, Mark Shepard in Wisconsin, author of Restoration Agriculture, which I'm also going to show on the screen here, he wrote this book. Shows how it is possible to supply our staple food crops, the bulk carbohydrates, proteins, and oils in our diet, through perennial methods. Not everyone has the luxury to have land to grow food on, and even fewer, if any, are able to subsist entirely on their own land. So Mark writes, given the lack of real examples of backyard systems where a family can grow all their own food, not just fruits and vegetables, and since we obtain the majority of our staple crops from farms anyway, we need to turn our attention to the process of obtaining our staple foods from fully functional, perennial ecological farming systems. Mark designed his farm, and you can go to the next slide, called New Forest Farm around the oak savanna, which is the forest ecosystem that predominates in his area. He is imitating the natural forest ecosystem, preferentially selecting food crops over other species, and using it to grow fruit and nut trees as well as berries and livestock. You can also see in the image that he has grown his trees on a pattern of straight lines. So it's not just willy-nilly planting trees everywhere. There is a pattern and a method to what he's doing. If you want to learn more about his methods and techniques, I highly recommend his book. Some of you may have also seen the documentary, The Biggest Little Farm. Next slide, please. It's pictured here from above, where you can see the way they have incorporated trees on their property. And interestingly, their farm is also regenerative agriculture certified, which is a new certification akin to organic certification, but broader reaching. I'd recommend watching the doc if you get a chance, as it is quite heartwarming and inspiring, while also showing some of the challenges they faced in setting up their farm. So there are solutions for every scale, from the backyard to the farm, and we can get involved in various ways, whether that is restoring your own land or working on someone else's land, supporting those who are farming regeneratively, advocating for policy changes, voting strategically, or spreading awareness. Similar to how weaning our society off of fossil fuels will require personal action, cultural shift, corporate responsibility, government policy, and international cooperation, acting at multiple levels can have a reinforcing and positive feedback effect that I believe we will need to meet the challenge. Thanks for your time, and I think we're going to field some questions. You can go to the next slide. It just says the end. Yeah, there.
Yeah, so thank you, Connor, for your presentation. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute and ask, or if someone's asking you want to get in line, you can pop in on the chat as well.
Yeah, you're going to read me the questions, or how's the questions going to go?
Yes, we can read you questions if any are posted in the chat, and if anyone wants to unmute their mic, they can also do that.
Right.
Well, to start things off, what are some perennial crops that you'd recommend for Ontario? Or some of the ones you're growing at Black Creek Community Farm?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't delved into how exactly I would redesign Black Creek Community Farm around something like Mark Shepard's concept of identifying your biome, which is like your broader ecosystem, and then selecting the kind of predominant what's the word I'm looking for? Penultimate? No. Anyway, I can't. Yeah, I haven't quite looked into it, but we do have a food forest that we plant with many different species of fruit and mostly fruit trees. We haven't done a few, maybe just a few hazelnuts. I think we have. Yeah, but it's a little bit. It's a little bit more willy-nilly than what Mark Shepard is doing in terms of he has a real system of planting in rows, and he grazes livestock underneath, and whereas our food forest is a little bit more more akin to the tropical home garden that I was referencing, but just a little bit bigger. It would probably be more manageable if it was on a tropical home garden kind of size. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know if that answered the question fully, but great. Thanks.
So Beth has a question in the chat. Let's ask, I'm curious how to get more youth involved in permaculture and regenerative farming.
Yeah, that's a good one. I don't know. I was just, when I heard about it, I was kind of it just really appealed to me. I don't know. I assume that's the case for everybody. So
Yeah, thank you. I guess my question, in Black Creek Community Farm, do they have like a youth outreach program or volunteers, or how do they get kind of people to their farm, and especially I guess younger people?
Yeah, with the pandemic, it's been a little bit muted, but we definitely have volunteers. We have like a kind of a drop-in volunteering program. The food forest we consider to be part of our farm park, which just is all the space on the site that's not the market garden. And we have volunteering on Saturdays for that. It's not specifically targeted to youth. It's just, anybody who wants to come can come. But we have had specific youth programming in the past, just depending on funding and such. But and hopefully we can have some more youth targeted stuff in the future.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
So Sophia also has a question. Sophia, I'm not sure if you want to ask it yourself or if you want me to read it.
Yeah, I can ask it. I guess I was interested by the concept of cover crops. I've never heard of that before. I'm just curious what's done with them, since they're not like intended to be harvested. I guess like after they're done being used, for lack of better words, like what's done with them?
Yeah, for sure. Good question. So either you there's a couple different, you can till them in, which is very common, and that just kind of feeds the soil, but at the same time you're tilling, so it's kind of a double-edged sword there. So a no-till method it's called crimping, and basically you wait until the cover crop has reached its flowering stage, where and then you basically kind of like steamroller over it, but the steamroller has little like blades that crimp the stalks, and so it flattens it down and kills it actually, because of the crimping action. The moisture, the water can't get up into the stalk anymore, and then you can go along and you can plant directly into that mulch, that where the cover crop is creating a mulch on the soil surface. And it works really well for like tomatoes and squash and like things that are planted kind of like far apart. Yeah, but you can also, I think, do it. I've never done it myself. I've just seen other people talk about it, but yeah, I think those are the main things. You have to terminate it or kill it in some way, and either mow it and till it in, or crimp it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Oh yeah, oh, farm animals, genius. Yeah, see, incorporating animals. Yeah, there you go.
I just have a question. I was curious about what restorative agriculture techniques you use at Black Creek Farm. Like you mentioned the food forest, but are there other permaculture techniques that you use at all?
Well, I did experiment with the this deep compost mulch, which is very popular, and I mentioned Richard Perkins and some other people. Charles Dowding are big proponents of this no-dig vegetable production. Basically, you kind of spread a deep layer of compost over the soil, and then you plant directly into that. And the thick layer of compost suppresses the weeds, and you don't have to. And the compost is loose enough that you can just plant right into it. It's not like it's you have to work it up or anything. Yeah. So that's one example in the market garden. And yeah, in the food forest, I'm not much of an expert on, like, I think in permaculture they're called guilds, which is where you kind of plant beneficial plants around fruit trees that have beneficial interaction in terms of pests and disease and soil fertility and stuff like that. Kind of, I guess companion planting would be the kind of vegetable garden equivalent of that. We don't do a ton of companion planting, but we do kind of plant, or we don't do a lot of intentional companion planting per se, but we do just kind of put herbs and flowers and stuff at the edges of our beds, and sometimes in the beds themselves, just to attract and provide habitat for beneficial insects and food for the bees and stuff like that. Is that okay?
I have a question for you, Connor. I know this might not be your area of expertise, but as you're talking about all of these sustainable farming practices, I can't help but think about sustainable financing that would be needed to support these practices, especially as you mentioned, farms are taking risks by implementing new techniques that may or may not be successful. So just your thoughts around this, like how are farms, covering their startup costs, and what happens if a crop fails?
Yeah, that's a good question. As you say, I'm not an expert, but I would kind of like to see like some government involvement in subsidizing potentially regenerative practices, or you could I mean, there is insurance, there is crop insurance. Most farms have crop insurance anyway, because they're very vulnerable to the weather, and yeah, most farms already have crop insurance, so there is maybe there's a mechanism there for supporting a switch to regenerative practices. I'm not quite sure. Maybe your insurance rates would skyrocket. I don't know. But yeah.
That's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there would definitely have to be some kind of, you definitely have to really involve the large farms and see what they need and what they're willing to do. Yeah.
In terms of, bigger farms moving towards a more regenerative gardening, like, I am so inspired by the Biggest Little Farm, but they literally, the first thing that they did was they did everything. And I was just like, how did they get the funding for that amount of land, all of those animals, all of that crops? It was just outrageous. So I'm curious to see, like, could you like transform kind of a little bit and slower and kind of take certain steps to, I guess, get there, instead of just like, oh, okay, we're gonna start a farm and 100% all the way?
Yeah, definitely. I think you can do it slowly, incrementally. I'm sure maybe just converting, some of your acreages, testing it out, making timely equipment sales or purchases. I think there definitely are ways to do it incrementally. It does seem like it's easier if you can kind of like, well, maybe not. I really can't say, but because they did have a lot of challenges in setting up their farm as well. But in some ways, if you start off on the right foot in terms of making the right investments when you're starting out, I think that would make it easier, instead of you're kind of locking yourself in if you've already made investments towards a certain path of non-regenerative agriculture.
Thanks.
Charlene also asked a question in the chat. I'm not sure if you wanted to elaborate more on it, Connor. Charlene asked, since annual crops dominate most of our diet, how can a person incorporate more perennial foods? What are more perennial foods or foods grown through perennial methods?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess you could just research what are the perennial crops in your area and see if there is a market for it. If there is a market, you could start purchasing, and you would have a small impact in that respect, but try to stick to native plants. Yeah. Yeah. If you also have the opportunity to grow your own food, you could experiment with perennial crops. I was reading a blog the other day about how garlic can be a perennial crop if you just let it grow. Like, because garlic you plant in the fall and then you harvest it in July, but if you just leave the bulb in the ground, it just naturally grows more garlic, but all concentrated in a clump, and you just can kind of keep harvesting it as you need, and it just kind of just grows. And this author plants these garlic cloves next to their fruit trees, and then they just always have garlic around, and the garlic keeps the deers away, apparently. So that was an interesting thing I was reading. So and also I think there is some research into trying to convert some of our annual crops into perennial crops, for like wheat, for example. I was reading that they're trying to do something to make wheat a perennial crop, and therefore you don't have to terminate it every year. But don't quote me on that.
Okay. Well, Connor, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge. It was a fantastic presentation. And now we will take a quick energy break, a quick 5-minute break. So feel free to turn off your video, take a quick 5-minute break, and we'll be back with the second half of our event, which will be the discussions.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, everybody.